I will move on. We would like to honor you with a proclamation from the city of Dover, and it's my great pleasure to read this. So whereas John Francis Durkin was born in Dover, New Hampshire on September 10th, 1927, to John Joseph Durkin and Kathleen Mary Goggin Durkin. He was the eldest of 12 children. And whereas John graduated from Dover High School in June 1945, like most young men of the age during World War II, John wanted to do his part and serve his country. So he joined the Merchant Marines. And whereas the first ship John was assigned to, the Conrad Corps, I believe, took coal and other merchandise needed supplies to Europe during the war. On later trips, John had a variety of assignments, including transporting sugar from Havana to Baltimore. And whereas John remained a merchant mariner until his transition to the Navy as a reserve officer in 1953. And whereas he married Rita LeBlanc of Dover in 1956, he raised 4 children and have the grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. And whereas John is the recipient of the Greater Dover Chamber of Commerce's Citizen of the Year Award, Dover Rotary's Paul Harris Fellow Award, and the first ever Community Builders Award from the Masonic Stratford Lodge. Whereas John apprenticed at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard working with computers for 4 years before leaving to join Honeywell. He retired from Honeywell in 1989, and whereas John and his wife Rita still reside in Dover in the original house they bought in 1959. Now therefore the mayor and city council and all citizens thank Francis Durkin for his dedication and service to Dover, in witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and sealed the city of Dover to be affixed the 27th day of January 2023. Robert Carrier, and I am proud, very proud to be here to be able to read this, as many here today are. And thank you so much for your service. Unbelievable.
Thank you.
At a young 95 years old. We are going around the city at some point, and we are giving proclamations, reading proclamations to anyone that turns 100, see you in 5 years. Okay? Well, you'll be here. You'll be here. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Commander Jeffrey Smith. Please.
Thank you, Mayor.
Welcome.
Senator Shaheen, Rear Admiral Auger, Lieutenant Durkin, friends and family. It is an honor and privilege to be invited to participate in today's ceremony. As senior leaders, there's a lot of day-to-day responsibilities we are entrusted with and unique opportunities to be a part of. But none are as rewarding as stopping all engines and taking time to honor the service of a fellow shipmate. Myself, having served on both surface ships and submarines, have a profound appreciation for those who were daring enough to serve on our merchant ships during World War II. It took a special person to ride the decks of those ships through enemy territory, unarmed and out in the open. Courageous is an understatement, but necessary it was. Relying upon those ships to weave their way through a minefield of enemy vessels and safely deliver their cargo, the United States and our fellow allies are forever indebted to the risks you and your shipmates assumed and the victories you have achieved. Our lifelines that were provided were many, whether it was munitions, fuel, spare parts, daily consumables, or an invoice of essentials, the vision of our merchant fleet breaching the horizon and heading inbound evoked an emotion of answered prayers to those desperately in need. It is no secret that the vital service you provided to our nation and the nations of our European allies is historically unsung. The movies and heroic tales of our servicemen and women during World War II and their heroic acts often do not include our merchant mariners and their unyielding service to the war effort. Associated editor of the Smithsonian Magazine, Ms. Milan Soli, stated that despite the fact it was the longest military campaign of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic, a 6-year fight for control of the eponymous ocean, is often overshadowed by other clashes in the European and Pacific theaters. Echoing those thoughts, lead curator of military history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Dr. Frank Blazek, simply states, "It's not the most glamorous campaign. But nevertheless, glamorous or not, the ability to efficiently replenish our American and Allied forces in time of war was a vital cog in the overall strategy of victory. The same is true today. It is absolutely paramount to be able to replenish the needs of the frontline forces. And while our merchant marines may not have dominated the recruiting posters and World War II newsreels of the day, you and your actions were the difference between victory and defeat. Following your service in the Merchant Marines, you served in the Navy and was later part of the shipyard team that brought our shipyard into the nuclear age. I'm sure that if we were to dig deep enough into the shipyard's archives, we would find shining accounts of your positive contributions, much the same as your spirited actions on the high seas. Lieutenant, you are a warrior. You are to be commended for your bravery and never-ending service to this nation. Thank you." And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. A native of Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, an honor graduate of the United States Coast Guard Academy, Rear Admiral John Mauger oversees a Coast Guard mission across 8 states in the Northeast, including 2,000 miles of coastline from the U.S.-Canadian border to northern New Jersey and 1,300 miles of offshore. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the podium Commander 1st District, United States Coast Guard, Rear Admiral John Mauger.
Fantastic. One sec here. All right, fantastic. So Senator Sheen, Mayor Carrier, Mr. Durkin, and service members and veterans all gathered here today. It really is an honor to be with you today to celebrate and be part of this prestigious award to Mr. Durkin, but really to recognize the work of all of our merchant mariners, both during World War II and then continuing on today. We heard a little bit from Commander Smith about the contribution that the Merchant Marine made to the overall war effort during World War II. We know that 250,000 Americans served in the Merchant Marine during that World War II period. And they, we heard about the dangers that they were exposed to. We understand how vital it was to have those ships bring over much needed supplies, both for the war effort and then for the rebuilding of both Europe and Japan afterwards. Unfortunately, at that time, our adversaries also knew how important that shipping was. And during the early years of the war, we were losing 2 ships for every one that we were able to build here in the U.S. And so that kicked off a major campaign to build the Liberty ships and the nearly 10,000 of those ships that were created during their time. But it also meant that many merchant mariners didn't come home. We lost nearly 10,000 merchant mariners during World War II. And thousands of others were exposed to perilous conditions, carrying over ammunition and traveling through treacherous waters. So it really is a remarkable occasion here to say thanks to these men. And I really appreciate the leadership by Congress to establish this medal and award this medal to our merchant mariners. Today, our merchant marine is equally important to the United States, right? We talk about a quarter of the U.S. gross domestic product annually. 25% of our economy comes through the maritime transportation system here in the U.S. I often try and make that tangible for folks and say, hey, go home. Take a look at the labels on your clothing, your furniture, your appliances, right? It generally says made somewhere else, or made of parts or materials from somewhere else. And all of that came on ships. And it still does today. Here in New England, right, the maritime transportation system is how we put shirts on our back, shoes on our feet. It's how we put food on the table here in New Hampshire and across the New England states. And importantly, as we stand here on January 27th, it's how we keep that boiler running in the house, because the home heating oil all comes on ships up through this area too. And so as Coast Guard members, we take that responsibility very seriously to make sure that the merchant marine is safe and secure and able to do their job. And so Mr. Durkin, thank you so much for your contribution and your role that's supporting our nation during its time. It's really an honor, and I enjoyed the chance to talk with you and enjoy the chance to spend time together. And as a mariner, hopefully, I know you're down in the engine room, and so you weren't up with the signal guys up on the bridge, but we have a term that says Bravo Zulu. And that's because in the days of old, we weren't able to just call somebody up on the sat phone and say, hey, thanks, you did a great job. And so we would raise the Bravo flag and the Zulu flag, and that meant job well done. And so, Mr. Durkin, Bravo Zulu to you, and thank you for a job well done. It's now my distinct pleasure to really introduce a leader in our national security here in the nation, a staunch advocate for our veterans, and a champion of small businesses here as well, which rely on the merchant marine system and merchant mariners. Senior member of the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee, Senator Shaheen is really well aware of the impact that our merchant marine and our veterans have had, and the contributions that they've made to the nation. Senator, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you here today, and thanks for the invite. Ladies and gentlemen, the Senior Senator from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral Walker and Mayor Carrier. So nice to be with you. Commander Smith, nice to have you here, and the other members of the Coast Guard. I've had the opportunity to go out with all of you and Admiral Walker. I can tell you they do a great job. And of course had a chance to see the excellent work that is done at the shipyard. So we are all very appreciative. And Mr. Durkin, Rita, to your entire extended family who are here, I feel so honored to be able to be here today to present this medal to you. I'm the daughter of a World War II veteran who lost his brother over the Pacific, and he was in England. He used to always say that when they found out he could type, they brought him in from the front lines and kept him in the office, kept him typing. But I know if he were here, he would be able to speak to the difference that you and other merchant mariners made for him and for everyone who fought in World War II. And we are all the beneficiaries of the work that was done by all of you who served in World War II, because without your efforts, we would not have the country that we have today. So thank you. And as I said, I feel so honored that I'm able to be here today to present this medal. And one of the things that I wanted to add to Admiral Walker's excellent explanation of what the merchant mariners did during World War II is the fact that on a proportional basis, we lost more merchant mariners during that conflict than any other branches of our military. And as Admiral and Commander both said so eloquently, I think it's a story that most of us don't know. And so it's really nice to be able to recognize your service and also to recognize your work in the Navy during the Korean War. Another conflict that sometimes doesn't get the recognition of what happened during that conflict and the fight that the soldiers endured that it should. So double thanks. It's a twofer. I think as a member of the Senate and Congress, the Congressional Gold Medal is really a way for us to remind Americans of everything that merchant mariners did to really enable victory during World War II, and an opportunity to say thank you to you for your service, and to all of those who missed you when you were gone. Rita, I'm sure you're on that list along with other family members. And the mayor read much of your biography in the proclamation from the city, so I won't repeat all of that, but one of the things that I found really interesting in Mr. Durkin's biography was that he wanted to enlist in the war effort when he was only 17, right out of high school, and he had flat feet, so he couldn't pass the test at that time. That was 1945. It was the end of the war, and the military was getting very specific about who they would allow in. Also, he wasn't 18 yet, I think, was part of the issue, and so he decided I think it was your father who said, you know, you might be interested in serving in the Merchant Marine, and gave you the support in the application to actually go down and join the Merchant Marine at a time when we knew the war was coming to an end and everybody didn't have to do that. So I think that, for me, was a story that really spoke to the commitment that you had to this country and to serving. So thank you so much for that. I know that we're going to hear from Ann in a little bit, who can talk about some of those other stories, but I want to just also remind us all that it was Ann who actually called our office about this recognition, because as most of us who know folks who served during World War II, we appreciate that you're very humble about your service, and you don't really seek honors or recognition. And so you didn't call us, it was Ann who called to make sure that you got to get the recognition that you deserve. So Ann, thank you very much for participation in helping to make this happen. And let me also recognize Laura on our staff, who is one of the staff people who helped to track down the medals and make sure that you were able to qualify, along with Bethany Urick, who is not here today, but who was also involved in that. So we coordinated with the Maritime Administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation to get the information, and it was an honor for our staff to play some small part in recognizing your service as a merchant mariner. There is very specific language that I am asked to provide when I present a medal to someone, and so I want to make sure that I get it right. But on behalf of the United States Congress and a grateful nation, please accept this medal as a symbol of our country's deep and lasting thanks for your service. So, Mr. Durkin, you pledge. hand, and I ask you to come and give some remarks on behalf of the family.
Good afternoon, Senator Shaheen, Admiral Mager, Commander Smith, Mayor Carrier, distinguished guests, friends, and family. On behalf of my father and our family, I thank you for joining us this afternoon to honor my father's service to our country. We especially thank Senator Shaheen and her staff for assisting us in obtaining the Merchant Marine Congressional Gold Medal for my father and for arranging this presentation ceremony. My father's journey to service of the country began just before high school graduation from Dover High, the building right next door, in April of 1945. As the senator mentioned, he went to enlist in the Navy and failed the physical due to flat feet. So he went home. He was at that point trying to decide how he was going to best serve the country upon graduation. So he went home, he was looking at the newspaper. My grandfather saw him looking at the Merchant Marine ad and said, "Is that something you might like to do?" And my father said yes. So they went to Portland and he signed up for the Merchant Marine. And then upon graduation, it was quite quickly, he went to Sheep's Head Bay in Brooklyn and did his training in the Merchant Marine. And his first trip was, his first ship was from San Francisco, so he had to take a train cross-country. So that was quite a bit for a 17-year-old young man from Dover to get on the train and actually travel across-country. And he was, his position was in the engine room, and he was a fireman and a water tender. And so, you know, he wasn't up on the deck by the, as was mentioned by the signaling people. The Conrad Course was his first ship. It was a Liberty ship. And since this was in the summer of 1945, victory had been achieved in Europe. And the ship was bound for Europe to help war-ravaged Europe. And they needed all kinds of supplies from us. First off, after the ship left San Francisco, it went through the Panama Canal and headed to New Orleans, and it needed to do some scheduled repairs in New Orleans. It was September of 45, so while they were there, Dad he turned 18, and he had to go appear in person at the draft board. So he had to traverse across New Orleans to the draft board, and his draft card is over there, a copy of it, and it's got a stamp from the New Orleans draft office, and then it's got a stamp from Dover when the card got back to Dover. And so that was he thought that was quite interesting, taking the cable car across New Orleans. After they left New Orleans, they went to Pensacola, Florida to pick up coal, because that was one of the big things that they needed in Europe. And I actually found a picture, and it's over there on the table from the National Archives. And it was from October of 1945 and showed the Conrad Course in port in Marseille, France. And they were unloading the coal. And the interesting thing on the caption was it was being unloaded under the supervision of the French, but by German prisoners of war. And I mentioned that to Dad, and he said he hadn't ever known that it was being unloaded by German prisoners of war. And it's sort of an interesting thing because the war in Europe was already over, but they apparently still had German prisoners of war in October. The Conrad Corps picked up munitions and other U.S. military supplies that were in Europe that needed to get back to the U.S. And they brought the supplies back to a munitions facility in New Jersey. And the ship also still had the guns on it, because when it left San Francisco, we were still, the war was still going on, and so it was still armed. So it went to New Jersey to have the guns taken off. And then my father continued in the Merchant Marines for another almost 10 years. And he really traveled the globe and saw all kinds of different things. He was on one ship, the Foundria, and it traveled quite a bit back and forth between the U.S. West Coast and Japan during the Korean conflict, delivering much needed supplies. And then I'll close with telling a story. Well, after Dad left the Merchant Marine, he was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve and served on 2 different ships, and there's paperwork on those ships over on the table. And he was proud to serve his country. And then I'm going to close with a funny story he told us. It happened really during the time of the Korean conflict. He was serving still in the Merchant Marine, and he had been on a ship for a year that it traveled the globe. And it also for a time went back and forth between the U.S. and Japan. And then he decided after a year it was time to come home to Dover. And so he had to get back to Dover from San Francisco. It was his first time on a plane, and it was a propellant plane, so it had to stop several times crossing the country before he got back. And he ended up at Logan Airport at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I think he made a phone call to try to see if there were any trains to Dover, but there weren't any trains. And so he was kind of deciding what to do, and a cabbie approached him and said, "Where are you going?" And he said, I'm going to Dover, New Hampshire, and it's near Portsmouth. And the fellow said, "Well, I've been to Portsmouth once." And so Dad said, "Well, I can direct you." And so they headed for New Hampshire. They got into Dover. At that time, Dad's family was living on 6th Street in Dover. And so he directed the cab driver right up Central Avenue, right through the heart of Dover, northbound. But during the year that Dad had been gone, they changed the traffic pattern on Central Avenue. And they made the center of town, right where all the stores are, one-way southbound. And so, it was probably 3:30 in the morning. They got stopped by the Dover police for going the wrong way. And so Dad explained it to the police officer, and they didn't get a ticket. And the one thing, I asked Dad, well, how much did it cost for that? Because that's, love to know, how much did it cost in, the early 1950s for that cab ride, but he doesn't remember, so that's just going to be a mystery forever. But my dad was fortunate to be able to serve his country and see the world at the same time in the Merchant Marine and also in the U.S. Navy Reserve. And my father and all of us thank all of you for joining us today on this joyous occasion and honoring his service to our great country. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I hope you'll take a few minutes and look at some of the memorabilia there, because that really tells the story as well. And we're so pleased that you could all come and celebrate with us your service, Mr. Durkin. Thank you so much.